I'm John Duval. Welcome to the Scriptural Way Bible Study. The Scriptural Way Bible Study is brought to you by the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ, located at 16300 North May Avenue, Oklahoma City. On behalf of the elders and members of the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ, I would like to thank you for your interest in spiritual matters. Now, let's take our Bibles and seek the Scriptural way. Good evening. I'm John Duvall.
And I'm Dale Decker.
And I'm Luke Haley.
And this is the Scriptural Way Bible Study. We'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy Tuesday afternoon to join us for this time period of studying the Word of God, seeking the Scriptural way. Dale, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing fantastic today. The weather is just beautiful, and I can't ask for anything better.
Oh, it is. We need an outside cam for these summer afternoons now. It looks pretty outside.
It would be, but the wind's blowing too hard.
That's a good point. Luke, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good.
When does the wind not blow too hard, Dale?
In Oklahoma, it always blows.
Well, hairspray makes a thriving business here in Oklahoma. So, hope everything is going well where you're at tonight. I realize that oftentimes, especially as the summer rolls on and the days stay lighter longer, that there are more things calling your attention in the afternoons. And again, we appreciate you joining us, taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. If this is your first time, we'd love for you to participate in the Bible study. Feel free to use the chat window located to the right of the video window. If you would like, you can sign in. I've said this before, I've had no luck signing in with Facebook. And what happens with me when I hit sign in with Facebook, it says too many simultaneously, blah, 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 blah. And I have to literally close the browser and choose a whole nother program or try to clear the cache. So I just pick guest, although we own the thing. Sign in John Duval. You can also create an account with the hosting and the chat roll host that we use. Create your own little account there. It's free and you can sign in with that. But most importantly, we love to hear from you. Let us know your name if this is your first time. Tell us where you are from as well, so that we know where our participants are from in this big, wide world that God has created for us. Last week we began a study looking at what does the Bible say about addiction. Now, this is a very important study. I recognize that all Bible subjects are important, but this one hits home with a lot of individuals. Many Christians have fallen prey to addiction of one form or the other. And last week we spent the majority of our time looking at the fact that looking at some of the various types of addictions that are out there and what the Bible has to say in regards to us as Christians, making certain that we are living our lives according to His Word. The first primary point that we made last week is that addiction is a form of idolatry. So if I allow myself to succumb to an addiction, I am worshiping an idol for all intents and purposes. And I think one of the things that we talked about last week maybe was that addiction is a worship of oneself. Not simply something else, but also oneself, one's desires, etc. And it is a challenge for everybody. Tonight, Dale, we're going to be starting with number 2, main section number 2 in the lesson copy. If you haven't downloaded that, please do so. And with the second problem we find regarding addiction is that it's the reign of sin within our life, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is.
Yeah. I want to clarify, I put addiction as the reign of sin. Any time that we allow ourselves to continually sin is reigning. But with addiction, it's even more so. It is the habitual compulsion to do whatever it may be. And therefore, it is sin reigning within our lives.
Well, that's exactly right. And Paul had a lot to say about this with the Church of Rome. First off, in Romans, the 6th chapter, verses 1 and 2, he says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein?" And then he went on down in verses 12 through 16. He says, "Therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in its lust. And do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. And then in verse 14 he says, for sin shall not have dominion over you. For you are not under the law, but under grace. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? Certainly not. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slaves whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness? And that's exactly right. Any addiction that we have, no matter how simple we think that addiction may be, whether it's use of tobacco products, we become a slave to that addiction.
That's right. That's exactly right. It is, as Paul says here, do not let sin reign in your mortal bodies. It is sin reigning within our bodies.
This fits over to what Paul wrote to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where he says, all things are lawful for me, but all things are profitable for me. And he goes on to say that I will not be mastered by anything.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good point. There are some things that are addictive that clearly in and of themselves, even not being addicted to them, they are a sin. They definitely are sin. But there are some things that the thing in and of itself may not be wrong, but it is the addiction to it, the being brought under the power of this thing that is a sin within our lives there. And as Christians, we must recognize that we are supposed to be alive from the dead. We're supposed to be alive from that dead way of living to Jesus Christ, and must not succumb to submit to that reign.
And this is the paradox, I guess. So your life's supposed to be controlled by God, by Christ. That's the forefront. When your mind is being controlled by this substance or this behavior, you're not. God is no longer your master, but this behavior, this addiction is.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And go ahead, Dale.
Well, if there's some things, and not trying to put you on the spot, but you said some things may not be wrong, but if we're addicted to them, then that's not good.
That's right.
I can't think of anything, though, that wouldn't be wrong that we're addicted to unless it's service to God.
Well, that's right. That's exactly right. As a matter of fact, we should view our service unto God as something that let me stop. Let's talk about that for a moment. That's a very good point. The typical definition of addiction is, or what we looked at last week, it was the habitual compulsion.
Right.
Okay. Habitual almost implies you don't even think about it. You just do it without thinking about
Right.
it. Well, our service unto God must always be with thought. It shouldn't be just a matter of rote or habit. With that being said, think about Bible study for a minute. We're supposed to study the Bible as much as we can. But there are times within our lives where Bible study in of itself may not be appropriate. If I'm having to ride a city bus, I don't want the bus driver reading his Bible. Now, can he think about it, meditate upon it? Absolutely. But I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, though. If we're going to have one thing that dominates our life, that one thing must be God. And our worship in Him.
And it should be, getting back to the word addiction and everything, the definition of it, our worship to God, we shouldn't have to think about it, but we should have to think about the fact that we have a specific schedule that we want to keep. Mm-hmm. And for example, we want to worship with the brothers and sisters in Christ on Sunday morning.
Right.
So we've got to make that a habit, that we're going to get up at a certain time. We're going to prepare ourselves. We're going to go to bed at a certain time on Saturday night, so that we wake up in the morning refreshed, and we're looking forward to spending that time with our brothers and sisters in Christ. Same thing on Sunday afternoon. There's a specific time, and we make those things a habit.
That's right.
Because when we come to God, it should not be something or to worship service, it should not be something that we're forcing ourselves to do. It should automatically be something we want to do.
That's exactly right. A desire on our part to do that. And you're right, that's the only thing that we can, in a sense, be addicted to. And it get us to heaven.
That's right.
Yeah.
If you want to compare the two, there's a stark contrast of being, if we want to use the term or the phrase addicted to service to God versus addicted to whatever substance or behavior, there's a difference. And that is when our lives are completely devoted to service to God, there is there's a reward in that. everything in our lives falls into place when God is put first, in terms of our obligation towards our spouse, and to our children, and towards our job. Our lives are enriched, they're fulfilled, we have meaning, and in the end we have eternal life, life everlasting.
Right.
An addiction to a substance or behavior, to the addict, it appeals that it's benefiting you. But that's the irony in the fact that it's destroying you. And it's like, I think about the alcoholic who's so addicted to alcohol that they will spend all the money to purchase alcohol instead of feeding themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll actually deprive themselves of the nourishment that keeps them alive in order to maintain the addiction to the alcohol.
Right.
The addict doesn't know it's destroying them. And when we're totally devoted to God, addicted to God, I guess if you want to use that phrase, it fulfills your life.
Right. It's interesting. I think when we're talking about God, the word devotion sounds better than addiction.
It does.
Absolutely.
We use the term loosely, I
Yeah.
should say.
But you made a very good point there in that, you think about of all the addictions, and we're including now the being addicted to God, as it were, there's only one that will benefit you in life, and that's your service unto God. You cannot go wrong with that.
No.
All the other ones will end up harming you in one form or fashion.
And I want to clarify a point too. Like I said, when God is first, every other relationship and obligation automatically falls into its rightful place in our life.
That's right.
With addiction, you will lose your family, you will lose your friends,
Yeah.
you lose your job, you will lose your life.
That's right.
Everything will be lost from you. You will be completely utter alone. Just you and your addiction is left.
That's right. That's exactly right. We had a couple comments come up here in the chat room. Well, John had one in there, and I've seen that it's gone, John. So if you want to put that in. Well, John used the case in point of eating. All right, you think about it. There's nothing wrong with eating. We have to eat to live. But eating can become addictive. Using that, as Paul says, I will not be brought under the power of any, as an example for that. Lynette Williams makes a good point quite simply. She says, we should live for the glory of God. And that should be the goal of our life, to bring Him glory, to let that light shine. Alan does remind us, though, that Peter says in 2 Peter 2, 19 through 21, that it is possible that after we've escaped, that we could be drawn back into. In other words, we've escaped from sin. But addiction is in part us being drawn back into the world of sin and sin within our life. And Randy says from Matthew 22, 37 through 38, that we should love the Lord our God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And Mark 12 adds with all your strength. And then from Romans 12:2, Randy reminds us that he says, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Transformation is the ideal word to use there, because it is a complete rewriting of who we are. Imagine if they could go in and rewrite our genetic code. Imagine being able to have a procedure that without a bottle, they can turn your hair blonde. Yeah. Just take this, and spend 5 minutes in this chamber and you've got blonde hair, your eye colors have changed, we've reshaped your nose, this thing and that. Well, we are rewriting the very basis of who we are spiritually when we undergo that transformation. And then John says, Paul told Titus in Titus 2:6 to be sober-minded. We should always be in control and not allow ourselves to be brought under the control of any addiction. And that's a very, very good point with that. It's something we have to take to heart always. Luke, let's take a moment and look at Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. And we're going to find here the reason why sin is able to reign within our lives and exactly how it relates to the devil.
Okay. Hebrews 12:1, the writer says, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us.
He makes a comment here about, and the sin which so easily ensnares us. A snare is a trap. And when we run, we need to lay aside any of the weights there. I think it's the story of Absalom. Remember the story of Absalom. What was the biggest thing that ended up being to the detriment of Absalom?
It's pride.
No, his hair. Do you remember how they called Absalom? His hair got tangled up in the tree.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I was already
being chased in this forest and got tangled up. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, now Paul talks about lay aside every weight. Mm-hmm. Well, in this case in point, there was something about him that became a hindrance. when he literally was riding on his horse trying to get away, his hair got caught in the tree. Well, we need to lay aside anything that sin could use to entangle us, to entrap us.
I heard a lesson preached, it has been over a decade ago. It was back when I was in college down in Lubbock. And it was centered around this verse, Hebrews 12, verse 1, about laying aside every weight. And it was about self-imprisonment is what the preacher called it. And what he was talking about was the fact that there are certain aspects of our lives that aren't inherently sinful, that self-doubt, like guilt, that hinder us from being successful spiritually.
Yeah.
And this topic of addiction fit into that, because literally what you've done when you've committed yourself to this addiction and it reigns in your life is literally you've put bars around yourself.
That's right.
It is impossible for us to proceed or grow spiritually or have any spiritual success when our lives are being dominated by this behavior, by this substance.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We basically allow ourselves to be caught by the devil.
Yes.
In 1 Peter 5:8, Peter, notice what he says here regarding the devil. He says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." You think about how many lives have been devoured by addictions. How many families have been destroyed by addictions. Not only will our physical lives suffer when we allow this sin to reign within our lives, but our spiritual lives. Our souls will be devoured by the devil. Dale, any thoughts?
Well, Paul said to the church at Thessalonica in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 5 through 7, kind of going along with what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 5. He says, "Ye are all the children of light and the children of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober. For they that sleep, sleep in the night, and they that be drunken are drunken in the night. But let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for an helmet the hope of salvation."
Yeah.
The idea, when you think about most addictions that we can think of today, most of those things are done at night.
That's a good point.
People who are alcoholics generally tend to drink at night. This is why bars are so profitable and everything, and they keep the lights dim and everything, because people, when they have these kinds of addictions, don't like to be seen. There's only a few addictions that are done in plain daylight. Use of tobacco is done, and quite honestly, people who use tobacco and are addicted to it think that everybody else is wrong.
Well,
They have a big problem with why everybody else has a issue with them. Why can't we smoke in the restaurants? Why can't we smoke wherever we want to?
Yeah.
Why can't we smoke in the airport? The fact that I have to breathe that secondhand smoke doesn't mean anything to them, because they're addicted to it, and we should be more tolerant of their addiction.
well, that argument goes with a lot of things that are wrong that people, well, it's my right to do.
Well,
Who are you to
exactly
tell
right.
me that I can't do this, no matter how detrimental it may be? Yeah.
But most addictions are in fact done in a closet,
That's
so
right.
to speak,
That's
where
exactly
others
right.
can't see it.
And-
And they look for that self-gratification, that self-reward, and it's a false reward.
Right. Momentary.
It's
false
momentary
reward. Yeah.
because they have to continue to do it to continue to get some type of high, and oftentimes it leads to even greater addictions because the high that they once got was not enough.
That's right.
Whereas if we serve God and everything, the rewards we get with God are not false, and we don't have to continue to seek something greater to get that reward and to get that satisfaction.
That's right. That's right, Luke.
That's one of the biggest traps about addiction. You can see it when you analyze or you read the steps AA gives out for recovery for alcoholics, and one of the first one we as we all know is admit there's a problem. That's the deception that the addict places upon themselves. Is they will not admit the destruction they're bringing upon themselves and everyone around them. You make some points here. You consider the lives that have been devoured by addictions, the families that have been destroyed, the utter destruction you bring upon yourself and everyone you love, and you do not know it. There's some interesting passages I found that kind of hint at this.
Mm-hmm.
Proverbs chapter 23, actually 29 through 35 actually talks about the drinker, but he talks in verse 34, he says, or 35, he says, "They struck me, but but I did not become ill.
Right.
They beat me, but I did not know it. When shall I wake? I was seeking another drink. As if this person doesn't know the physical harm that's coming upon them. They're oblivious to
Right.
it.
Yeah.
They can't see the problem. Another quick passage real fast, Isaiah chapter 56, verse 12 says, "Come, they say, let us get wine, let us drink heavily of strong drink, and tomorrow will be like today, only more so." Nothing's going to change. There is no danger. I'll drink now, and tomorrow I'll wake up, I can do it again, and there'll be no results of my actions.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's
Exactly.
the deception in addiction.
That's right.
Ultimately, that you've trapped yourself in.
And even with sin in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we need to go ahead and take our first break for this evening. And when we come back from that break, we've got a few more points to make about addiction being the reign of sin within our lives, and what we're going to be looking at when we come back from the break there. Aside from a couple of comments we'll bring up here in just a moment, we're going to be showing from Ephesians 2, verses 2 through 3, that essentially it's the desires of the flesh and of the mind that an addict is trying to fulfill. And we have to separate that if we are going to make it to heaven. So we'll look at that more on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Ron Witt, one of the elders of the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ. On behalf of the elders and members of the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ, I would like to invite you to be our guest at any of our worship services and Bible classes. The meeting place of the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ is located at 16300 North May Avenue, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, zip code 73013. The Seminole Pointe Church of Christ meets Sunday mornings at 9:30 for Bible classes, 10:30 for worship service, and 5 p.m. for our afternoon worship service. We also have Bible classes on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Whether you live in Oklahoma City area or you are traveling through Oklahoma City, we would love to have you come and be our guest. We have Bible classes for all ages. At the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ, our focus is to teach only the Word of God. Rest assured that when you visit with us, you will find that we will appeal only to God's precious Word. Now, let us return to our study.
Let's look at a couple of comments from the chat room. You know, it's the benefit of joining us live for the study. You actually get to see the comments in the chat room. But the reason why we like to pull them into the study is, one, they help our study. You know, we've said this before. You know, I could sit down and study the subject. The three of us could sit down and study the subject. But when you sit down with us and participate with your comments and questions, it makes the study that much more beneficial. Now, if you're viewing this at a later point in time, this is why we like to share them with you, so that you might benefit from the comments as well. We have three different reminders of Bible verses here. Randy reminds us of Galatians 5:1 and 2, where Paul tells us to stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again in the yoke of bondage. You know, telling us to avoid that entanglement, not to allow ourselves to get caught by that. Alan says in 1 John 5:4, for whatever is born of God cometh... Let me read that there. Let me go ahead and look at Randy's next one from Isaiah 5, verse 20 there. Randy says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and the light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And I think it's a good point, because oftentimes, and this goes back to what we're talking to, it is individuals who calls that which is evil good. Mm-hmm. You know, there's nothing wrong with it. It's okay. It's my right, my prerogative, and you got to put up with me.
Yeah, moreover, you'll find people who are addicted, find people who share that same addiction in order to find solace in or comfort in the fact that they're not alone.
That's right.
You have each one feeding off each other that what I'm doing is okay because they're doing it too.
That's right. That's right. What Alan put in there, he quoted it right. The fault was on me trying to read it. He says, this is 1 John 5:4, for whatever is born of God overcometh the world. And this is a victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. And that's a very good point. If we are born of God, and we are born of God as a result of our conviction that comes from a study of the Word of God, when we make that change, then we are able to overcome. And John makes a good point. in commenting on what Randy said just a moment ago, he talking about calling good evil and evil good. Gambling isn't wrong, some people say. It's just entertainment. Drinking isn't wrong, some people say. It's just how we relax, and that rolls right up into the practice of those who are addicted. Yeah. Well, Dale, let's look at Ephesians chapter 2, verses 2 through 3 for a moment.
Well, Paul said to the church at Ephesus, he said, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others.
It's interesting. Paul is commenting about their former behavior, before they became Christians. And he observes that they had conducted themselves, or Paul, grouping himself, conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh. And even Paul, who before he became a Christian, he was a faithful servant of God. Albeit after the death of Christ, he was serving God wrongly and not accepting the new covenant of Christ. But he still was abiding by the elements of the law. Thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, etc., etc. But he still viewed his former practices as being striving to obey the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind. And in the end, when that's our goal, we do become children of wrath.
Paul was, while he was guilty of that, though, he was guilty of it out of ignorance.
That's true. And he hadn't seen enough evidence to convict him that this Jesus was the Messiah.
Well, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And once he saw the evidence and everything, Paul was one who was willing to take a stand.
That's right.
For right. The person who is addicted, though, oftentimes refuses to see right from wrong.
Yeah.
And they will continue to justify what they're doing as right, as I think Randy mentioned a while ago. The gambler will always justify that there's nothing wrong with it. I'm just having a little fun.
Right.
And yet every state that starts the lottery or starts riverboat gambling or Indian casinos, they will always immediately start up an addiction clinic for the folks who are addicted to gambling.
If that's not a sign, I don't know what would be a sign. You think about it. And when tobacco companies, they are having to, they pay for a lot of the programs and things that are done to try to persuade people not to smoke.
Well, they do that because the federal law has stepped in and forced them to do that. If they had their choice, they wouldn't do it. In fact, if they had...
Yeah, that's a good point.
At one time, fortunately, for the most part, they've taken them off the market, but at one time, it was nothing for kids to go in and buy candy cigarettes.
I remember those as a kid.
Yes.
I used to buy those.
And it was a form of tobacco companies getting kids to where they were ready to start smoking.
And they smelt weird when you try to hold a fire to them, because they wouldn't burn. They just kind of sit there and melt.
Yeah, but that was because of ignorance. You're supposed to suck on them.
I remember, and I hadn't thought about that. I've not seen those in years.
Well, they still make them because we went to a dinner last year and they had some of the old candies that you could buy. Remember the little root beer drums that you could buy? Well,
those
they're
are
still
good.
around.
Yeah.
Just a matter of buying them. And so my wife took some of those home as candy. But my youngest grandson, the first thing he did was put it in his mouth just like a cigarette. So I took them away from him.
Because of the practice of putting, what it could lead to.
I mean, young kids are influenced by adults.
Yeah.
And this is the problem with addictions and everything. And these young kids, he's only 6 years old, but he knew exactly what to do with that candy cigarette because he's seen enough adults smoking, and they make it look like it's fun.
That's right.
Like it's enjoyable. And that's how the young kids get addicted. The same thing with drinking. Adults make it look like it's pleasurable. So young kids can't wait until they get old enough. In fact, it's a known fact that here in this city, parents have actually bought alcohol for their children's parties at their homes. So we're talking about young teenagers that they're buying this stuff.
Yeah.
We have the school system now that is promoting the purchase of condoms and stuff like that for
Yeah.
whatever. It's to try to prevent unwanted pregnancies, unwanted diseases, and stuff like that. Well, where does the school system get off telling parents that they don't know how to parent their child, and where does a parent get off not taking a stand against the school system
Responsibility
for
for their
allowing
actions.
things like this?
That's right. That's right. Luke?
Your passage in Ephesians that you brought out reminded me of a fundamental aspect of salvation. I mean, when we are united with Christ in His death, burial, and resurrection, we are freed from those bonds of sin. We're freed from the bonds of this fleshly body in the sense that we are no longer condemned by our sins and we have an avenue for forgiveness to God.
Right.
When we enter ourselves and we bind ourselves to an addiction, what we've essentially done is we've chained ourselves back to this flesh.
That's
we
it.
put the flesh
Yeah.
back into control. What a shame.
That's right.
It is that you once been freed and now literally you've taken your body and it's now become your master again.
That's right. You're now serving it.
It is not the Spirit.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Randy in the chat room does remind us of the bubblegum cigars.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
I remember those too.
Yeah, and they're still out there. When you have a baby, you can order
Yep.
them, and again, don't try to light them. That doesn't work too well. But Randy remembers a time when kids could go in and buy real cigarettes for their parents, no questions asked. But the law has done a few good things to at least hinder it to some form or fashion, I would think. But and one thing one point I want to make before we continue, especially to our younger people, Hev Parks, who has joined us, she may be one of our younger ones tonight. Not sure how old you are, Hev. I think she's a teenager. She may be 17, 18 years old. She's a faithful Christian, and teenagers oftentimes they really endure a lot of pressure, peer pressure. Adults can as well. But when you are an adult, you've lived long enough, you've developed your own personal strength and fortitude to stand. But even for a Christian, those teenage years are still very difficult at times. And many teenagers, I could give you an example of one person, right, who had the potential of doing something great with his life. But because as a teenager, he allowed himself to get hooked into drugs and became a drug abuser, he threw his life away. So now the person's 50 some odd years old and he has nothing, not even a family to show forth from his life. And it's tragic. It's very tragic. Chance makes a good point. He says, God is our judge. When we occupy the judgment seat and justify what we do, we will never convict ourselves. That's why God's standard, the Word, settles it permanently what is good and righteous or bad. Chance Dell is in the training program with Randy. He served with Randy in the service for a number of years, and Chance and his wife have moved up to the Duval Barracks there in St. Robert, Missouri, and he's going through the training program as well. Alan says the world fits God into their lives instead of fitting their lives into God, and that was a very good point. Very, very good point there. Well, think about what David says in Psalms 119, verse 33. If sin is reigning in our lives, we need to say what David said. Direct my steps by your word, and let no iniquity have dominion over me. David was praying for strength. He wasn't praying for God to miraculously remove the dominion from David's life. He allowed sin to have dominion. Look at the affair he had with Bathsheba. But he's praying for strength. And if we will trust in God and pray that the Lord will help us to overcome, we will be able to overcome because we know we're not alone. We're not trying to do it on our own. We trust within the Lord. And Dale, that makes sense because we know that we can't serve two masters. So if we are serving God, then we're not serving ourselves. And with that, we can overcome.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, if you look at Matthew, the 6th chapter, verses 19 through 24, in reference to what you just mentioned here, it says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust does destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you in darkness, or is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon.
That's exactly right. And that is what, in the end, it boils down to.
That's true.
Yeah. A very good point Daniel has made in the chat room. I will say, for those who may not know this, if you've been with us for a while, you know this already. Randy is Daniel's father. Alan is Randy's brother. And they are not related to me at all, except spiritually. Well, maybe they are. Randy's father looks a lot like my uncle Roy.
I thought the pronunciation, I think you pronounce it Duval and they say Duval.
No, I think they put the emphasis where it needs to be, Duval. But I'm not sure about that. Okay. Now, my wife says it's Duval. She says, I ain't no Duval, I'm a Duval. I said, okay then, we got that one settled. But I think Daniel makes, the reason why I say this, Daniel makes a very good point. I almost got away from, almost strayed too far. Randy says, John, we are related whether you like it or not. That's right, we are. Daniel says, I think an important thing to keep in mind is that we have all been addicted to something in our lives. We should never look down on anyone for anything they do, no matter how extreme it may seem. We should be there to help them. And I think that's a good point. We have the tendency, we feel so, I'm not sure what the right word is, but when we look at someone who's lying in the gutter because they have overdosed on drugs, or they're puking their guts out because they are drunker than a skunk. We're up here in a very clean, antiseptic world, and we look down upon them and say, well, how could they be that way? Thank you.
Look what you've done to your life.
Yeah, look what you've done to your life. Shame on you. And we don't want to have anything to do with them. But in reality, we look at the Samaritan, a little bit reverse roles there. The Samaritan was willing to help the person who normally would look down upon him and shy away from helping him.
And that's actually a good point. When you think about what addiction does, specifically substance abuse, it becomes, and I'm not taking away responsibility from the individual,
Absolutely,
but it does
right.
in all senses of the term become a disease. It becomes a disease. That
Yeah.
body physically craves that drug, and it will override any rational thought in that person's mind. It's a disease.
Especially the chemical.
And I'm not saying
Yeah.
they don't have any blame.
Right.
I'm not taking away the sin out of it. But when you approach that person for help, they have to be approached as someone who is legitimately, at this point in their life, sick.
Yeah. And you don't simply go up and say, well, look, if you really wanted to stop, you could quit today.
Yeah.
Many times it's not the case. You have to get the right help for them.
Yeah. But you're right, you can't look down upon them at all.
There was a professional athlete that used this phrase at one time. He said, hate the game, not the player. And the same thing as Christians. We hate the sin, but not the sinner.
That's right. That's
Because
exactly right.
if we had the right attitude and everything, we might be the one person that could help that sinner get out from under that sin of addiction.
That's right. We're getting ready to take our next break. On the other side of it, we've got a couple comments to bring in from the chat room. But I want to tell you about a news report I saw this morning. It might have been on Fox News, if I remember correctly. But there was a fella who literally was trapped in mud. And not just a little bit. They showed what looked like to be a big old puddle of mud. And if you look closely, there was an outline of a man beneath the surface of that mud. And firefighters were called in to try to get him out. And they got him out successfully. But, sometimes we look at that, well, that's just mud. There's no way I'm getting myself muddy. There's no way I'm getting into that. And that's the way sometimes we may look down upon people who have allowed themselves to come that way. Rhonda, and I'll go ahead and bring this point in, and this is a very good point. Are we no better than the praying publican who says, I thank you that I am not like this man? If we get to that point, we're no better than that one right there.
To emphasize Daniel's point one more time, all sin entangles you.
Yes.
All sin does. We've all been where the addict is in some way, shape, form. It seems that we're all condemned by our own sins.
Right.
What addiction is, you actually can see the entanglement. It's
Right.
visible. No matter what type of addiction it is, you can see it, and therefore we're more judgmental of it. But there is no difference between that type of sin or any sin that you've been in.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Well, we'll take our next break, and on the other side of this, we're going to look more at this all-important subject. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hello there. I am John Duval. I am a member of and the preacher for the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ. Please allow me a few minutes of your time to share with you some information about the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ. Seminole Pointe Church of Christ is under the oversight of 5 elders who guide the congregation in their service to God. These elders lead a very faithful group of people who love God and follow His Word. The Seminole Pointe Church of Christ has Bible classes for all ages, which meet every Sunday morning at 9:30 and every Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock. Our Bible class teachers are dedicated to helping educate our children in the Word of the Lord and in the work of His church. On behalf of the members of the Seminole Pointe Church of Christ, I can tell you that our goal is heaven, and that we make every effort to ensure the Word of God is taught to every age group. It is our hope and prayer that you will take the opportunity to come be our guest and to learn more about us. You will find that we are a friendly and a loving congregation. Our place of worship is located at 16300 North May Avenue, Edmond, Oklahoma. Now, let us return to our study of the Scriptural way. You know, Luke just made a good point. Use the example of the guy trapped in the mud, but with some of the heavy rains we get here, well, any place that you live where there's potential of flooding, they warn you, if you see water covering the road, don't go through it, because you may think you can handle it. Next thing you know, you're sitting there stuck, your car stalled. Regarding the chat room, some good points there. It was the Pharisee that made the point, I thank you, Lord, that I'm not like the publican, the sinner. I said that one wrong there. On the Duval front, Rhonda says, yes, I am a Duval, and Randy says, we actually claim Rhonda more than we do John.
I agree with that.
So, yeah, and that's the way it goes. But when Chance brings a very good point there, what I'm about to read here. He says, spiritual sickness is a condition with symptoms and behaviors. In the center is the absence of God. We must see them with love as Jesus would. And that's a good point. They are spiritually diseased. The church in Corinth, in 1 Corinthians 11, because of their abuse of the Lord's Supper, Paul comments that some of them were sick, some of them had even died spiritually. And I think that's a very good point there. It is a spiritual disease, which can be rectified, can be healed.
How pharisaical is it for us to look at someone caught in addiction down as someone who's with contempt? That's what they accused Jesus
That's
of.
right.
You know, the Pharisees would come and accuse Jesus, well, you're dining with publicans and sinners, accusing Jesus literally being unclean spiritually for his association with Gentiles.
Yeah. And we could do the same thing if we're not careful. That's exactly right. Well, let's look at another problem with addiction within our lives. When we look at it, we find that addiction is contrary to holy thought. Contrary to holy thought. We're going to look at this by beginning, Luke, let's step over to you there, Philippians chapter 4, verses 8 through 9. What happens with addiction, we end up focusing our mind on something that it must not be focused upon. We're not looking where we should look. And so let's see what Paul has to say about that.
Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, he says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. The things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you.
That's right. We need to be willing to remove from our lives all those things that are contrary to serving the Lord. It's kind of like if you smell a rotten potato in a bag of potatoes, you need to remove the rotten potatoes, or else the whole bag will go bad there. As Christians, we are supposed to be living holy. We're supposed to have our mind set upon things that are above, not on things that are below. As a matter of fact, Dale, that's what Paul says in Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, isn't it?
Well, it is, but I want to
Go ahead there.
read something else that Paul said to the Philippian church in Philippians, the 3rd chapter, verses 17 through 19. He said,
Okay.
brethren, be ye imitators together of me, and mark them which walk so as ye have us for an example. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping,
Right.
that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. And so Paul's saying there that we should be imitators of him, because he is a follower of God. He is an example to others. But the interesting thing he says there, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier, he says, I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are enemies.
Yeah.
You could see the sorrow in Paul and the sadness over what was taking place here with those people who were sinning.
That's right.
And then when he, as you mentioned in Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, if then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth.
That's right. That's exactly right. You see, when you look at addictions, you find that addictions feed off of and are driven by a person's love for the world, whatever it may be. Whether it's a substance, whether it is a habit, whether it is some sort of emotional craving, what happens at that point, the individual begins to feed off of that. And when we think about what John says in 1 John chapter 2, and if you've not studied 1 John 2 in a while, then you've not been following our broadcast for a while. Because we did an extensive study through 1 John, as well as 2 John and 3 John. But what was interesting in 1 John chapter 2, he makes the point there. He says, my little children, I write these things so that you may not sin. But if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the propitiation. Now, John is telling them that they're not supposed to sin. And he's telling them there that they are to be serving the Lord and following after him. Now, the way that we overcome sin is by not loving the world. And in 1 John chapter 2, 15 through 17, John warned them. He says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away in the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. And so, if we allow addictions to persist within our life, we are loving it, not God.
This is a good point to make just in studying addiction in general. Because what we find when you look at these verses is that the mindset of an addict literally is not compatible with that of a Christian.
Absolutely.
It's not an agreement.
Right.
There's no direct verses that are going to say, thou shalt not be addicted to cocaine, or thou shalt not be addicted to whatever.
Right.
But what you find is that the pattern of behavior that a Christian ascribes to does not fit that of an addict.
Right. That's exactly right. I've heard it said that some people have habitual tendencies. You've got some people who may overcome one addiction with another addiction. An individual who's addicted to eating, they may get that under control, but then it shifts to smoking. Or they overcome smoking, but it shifts to alcohol. Been cases like that. And with that type of personality, if there truly are addictive personalities out there, the best thing for them is to put that tendency, if you would, if that's a legitimate way of referring to it, to serving God.
Yeah.
Put that focus there.
Don't you think also, John, that if one who has addicted tendencies, if we want to talk about that, if this person is truly going to focus their mind, say, okay, my life is devoted to God, not towards X addiction, this person is going to do whatever it takes to overcome that tendency. If
That's
it
true.
means seeking professional help, whatever it is, that's what's going to take place in order that they can keep their lives spiritually established.
Right. And as we said before, we realize it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
You know, it's not an easy thing to do, but it is the thing to do if we want to overcome. Yeah. Paul in Philippians chapter 3, verse 19, he talks about setting, what happens when we set our mind on earthly things.
Well, that's exactly right. And of course, we read it a moment ago, but he points out that When we set our minds on earthly things, these things lead us to destruction. Whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame. Who set their mind on earthly things.
That's right.
And the idea is that these things become their idol, their God.
Exactly.
Whether it be the addiction of eating, continuing. I've got a nephew that concerns me greatly. He's 460 pounds or better. He won't eat anything but meat. And he'll die at a young age because of that. Same thing with tobacco smoking. They become addicted to it. If you've ever gone into a hospital and you've gone down into the morgue area and you've looked at cadavers and looked at their lungs, just totally black. But these people will totally ignore things like that because it is a idol or a god that is going to lead them to destruction.
Yeah. I don't know who funds them, but they've started running commercials now made or featuring individuals who are suffering due to smoke-related illnesses. And I tell you what, if it's intended to put a scare into people, to the people who may be considering it, it will scare them. To someone who's addicted to it, I don't know. Will it change them? But they're pretty eye-opening when you look at that.
Well, when you think about setting your mind on things above, a Christian is purpose in life is to serve God and bring your best towards God at all times. Not just in worship at church, but in every aspect of your life. You bring your best towards God. Is that possible with addiction in your life? I would say no.
Well, because again, you're worshiping some other God.
Yeah.
And that's what it boils down to. You may go to church services every Sunday, but if there's an addiction reigning within your life, you're not worshiping God. You're serving that addiction. Whose God is their belly, as we read just a moment ago. So we recognize we need to make the decision not to allow addiction to serve as an idol within our life. We must make certain that we do not allow addiction to be the reign of sin, and we must make certain that we do not allow addiction in because it's contrary to holy thought. But we also find that addiction rejects self-control. You think about that for a moment. Addiction is the rejection of self-control. We've made this point before, and I always like to emphasize this. In a strict way of speaking, self-control is to control oneself. So if I'm engaging in sin, I'm willfully choosing to sin, so I am controlling myself in that direction. But the way the Bible talks about self-control is the exercising of control over oneself to do that which is good, to not do that which is wrong. So that's how we're talking about self-control. Luke, look at 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 3, and notice those people that Paul comments on who would come.
Okay. He says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good."
Yeah, among the many things that are listed there, he makes the comment that these individuals are without self-control. They do not exercise it.
Yeah.
They choose to walk in this fashion and this fashion only.
Interesting enough, though, if you read verse 4 and the first part of verse 5 there, it also talks about traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God. But then he says, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof.
That's true.
And oftentimes people who have these problems do profess to be a follower of God and may even attend worship service and everything. But this is what you have to watch these individuals. In fact, Paul told Timothy from these type of individuals, not the individual necessarily, but the sin. Turn away from these things.
Right.
Avoid them. And do what you can to try to help that individual see that what they're doing is they're given a false impression here that they really don't love God, but what they love is the things that they're doing that is wrong.
That's right. That's right. Alan reminds us in regard to that, James 1:8 talks about the one who is double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. He's not stable in trusting in God and following God. He is unstable.
Yeah, that word double-minded literally means two-souled. It's as if one person, it's like they're schizophrenic. They have one part of their brain that is trying to grasp towards God, but a significant other part is stuck in the world on something else.
Right.
And that type of person cannot exist spiritually.
That's exactly right. Right. And not be right with God cannot be done.
We talk about self-control or self-governance. Literally, in terms of substance abuse, you're taking yourself down a path that you've made it physically impossible for you at times even to accomplish this task. I mean, when the body's addicted to a substance like alcohol, it's an easy example, or any type of drug, and that drug chemically alters the brain, the chemistry of the brain, you cannot go without it. The body won't let you go without it. And literally, the Bible commands self-control, and now you damage yourself so badly that it's impossible to achieve without medical intervention.
Hence the rehabilitation centers, where you pretty much put yourself into a situation where you have no control of your life. They force you, by your being there, to go without until your body's finally flushed of the chemicals long enough that then they can start working on the habitual side of it.
Interesting passage over in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 31. It says, "Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. At last it bites like a serpent, it stings like a viper." This is the part I wanted to focus on. "Your eyes will see strange things. Your mind will utter perverse things. You'll be like one who lies down in the middle of the sea, or one who lies down on top of a mast." We talk about just the ability to control the urges themselves, but when people get stuck in any addiction, you can't even control your various impulses. You can't control your body, you can't control your mind. You have no control of yourself whatsoever.
That's right. That's right. Had a couple of comments come up in the chat room. I want to bring those in. Before I do, I want to remind us of 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, where the Apostle Peter, he says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul." We have to choose while we have the full ability to abstain from these fleshly lusts. Don't allow ourselves to give in thinking that we can handle it. When my family when we went out to to California this past summer, the waves out there, this one particular day we decided to go get ourselves out in the nice icy cold water of the Pacific Ocean. Micah had a little bitty board that we bought that he could ride on everything. So he's out there, and the waves are getting pretty bad. There was a couple sections, the lifeguard said you can't swim in. I mean, the undercurrent's still bad. Well, Rhonda, she was nervous, and I was too. I decided to go out there and be with him. And I didn't have anything. And I thought, I'll be fine. But it took just a couple of waves to get me to where the water was over my head. A big old wave coming, I wasn't touching the ground at all. And me, in the poor shape that I am, had to swim. And I did okay, I made it back, but it wouldn't have been much for the lifeguard to finally say, "Let's go get that sap, get him out of the water now." But I thought it was going to be okay, thought I could handle it, And that's the way we do with sin. We think we can meddle in it right now and we'll be fine, and we're not. Good comments brought up in the chat room. Bob says, and I think this is an outstanding point, we must be careful when we speak about addictions. We must not put ourselves above those addicted to anything by saying, well, how can anyone become slaves to whatever you want to name that? Well, how could they do that? They're just stupid. It's an idiotic behavior. Well, we shouldn't be that way. We must not talk about them that way. The old saying, you must walk in that person's shoes to understand why they do what they do. It's a very good point. Very valid point there.
We're all equal heirs of grace.
Exactly.
All of us.
That's exactly right. Randy brought up what we talked about a while ago, Matthew 6:24, how that we cannot serve two masters. We'll hate the one and love the other, hold the one or despise the other. Jimmy, here in the room with us here, says from James 4:7, talked about this earlier, submit therefore to God, resist the devil and flee from you. He says many former addicts use this verse as a trigger to their addiction. I'm going to do so-and-so and use this verse to reverse the course. In other words, thinking, well, all you got to do is resist the devil and flee from you. But once you are in his army, so to speak, once you are hooked to that addiction, simply resisting sometimes isn't enough. You have to go beyond the mental resisting to the sheer will to resist. And then Chance says, I feel something as simple as fasting for a span of time can empower us to feel we can accomplish doing without something as necessary as food, and allowing us to lean greater on God. And that's an interesting point. The Bible doesn't require us to fast. But the point is, it does give you that time where you exercise a willful control in abstaining from something. And so it's, of course, as you can tell, I don't fast. Probably should, but any thoughts on?
There was a point made, I think it was Bob who made the point about not looking down potentially at the one who's an addict.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's a call throughout the New Testament that Christians, as they aspire to love their neighbors as themselves, to love their enemies, I believe that is a call that God has given us, that we should recognize the value of the human soul.
Right.
It's a very self-centered thing to look down at other people who are caught in sin, that you are yourself is not ensnared in the same thing. Well, how could you do this to yourself? God is calling to us in our striving to be perfect as He is perfect, that we would love the soul as He would. That when you
Right.
see someone caught in sin, that you would feel compassion for them, not disdain.
Exactly. And think about how we look to God before our obedience to the gospel.
Yeah.
How filthy did we look? And sometimes how filthy do we still look if we allow ourselves to walk in sin? That's a good point. Good point. Well, we've reached the end of the hour. We need to go ahead and pull tonight's study to a close. We will pick up here next Tuesday evening, Lord willing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about sin and addiction within our lives. And Lord willing, we're going to look at 7 things that we can do to overcome addictions or prevent addictions from developing within our lives. Dale, any final comments?
No, I do want to thank everybody for being in the chat room. We've had a lot of great comments tonight. And just as a reminder, next week I'm going to be kind of like Peter. Of course, Peter was a little bit discouraged whenever he said it, and I'm not discouraged, but I'm going fishing next week.
Okay.
And then the week after that, my good buddy Tennessee Bob and his lovely wife and my lovely wife, we're going diamond mining.
So retirement funds finally ran out, did they?
Well, it could be almost as bad as Gamblers Anonymous. We're going out there to look for that diamond that we'll probably never find. But should we find it and everything, it would be a nice gift for my wife.
Be good exercise.
It will be good exercise.
Luke, any thoughts or comments?
No, enjoyed being on the study.
Glad you're able to make it again this week there. It's been really good having you with us. Now you're going to be back to your normal work schedule next Saturday or next Tuesday.
Yes, I won't be here.
And Dale won't be here the next 2 Tuesdays.
Are you flying solo then?
I'm going to talk to John and see if his schedule will permit him to step back in. And I may talk to someone else here in the congregation.
Might talk to Ron Buxton even. And
see if Ron would like to join us. Yeah, Ron's been with us before. It's been a while back though. See if his schedule. He's another worker. Some people work for a living.
I don't understand why.
I don't either, and so that keeps them too real busy.
Perhaps if I'm not here, we'll actually finish this lesson.
Hey, let me tell you what, as I said earlier, it's always good to have participation, both from the 3 of us and from you. Your comments and questions help the study to be of a greater benefit in our lives. And if you have any questions or comments about anything that you've heard us say, don't hesitate to contact us. You can send your questions and comments to questions@scripturalway.org. We'll hope you can join us again next Tuesday night at 7:30 p.m. as we continue this study of what the Bible has to say about addictions. Thank you very much. We'll see you again next week right here at scripturalway.org.